You can record the session. Yeah, no worry. Okay, wow. Okay. So I can start right now, right? Yeah. Okay. Yes. Okay. Hi, everyone. So thanks for the wonderful introduction and thanks for the invitation. So happy to actually come back because this is a place that I have spent 2 years in my life. So even this is a virtual talk, but I'm so excited to come back. So in the past 2 years, I'm super sure this is a SICSS Singapore, and you must have a good day here and have lots of talks and activity, especially learn from each other. So I'm so happy to see that. I think this is SICSS Singapore second year or third year. Yeah, so it looks like you still are doing a really, really good job. So let me now start the main course. As I mentioned, I study how digital technologies, especially those related to media environment, shape people's information behavior, in particular news consumption. So the title today is Using Networks to Study Audience Fragmentation. So you can see, this is a title that highlights some methodological perspective. So what I want to show here is that by sharpening the tools, especially the network tools, network analysis can provide more insights into communication theories. So I will use the example of network analysis that I introduced here and audience fragmentation as an example. I know that SICSS is an event. We have many scholars from different fields. So I cannot assume that you all are aware of audience fragmentation. So let me still briefly talk about it. So basically in communication studies, the emergence of this line of research relate to the change of information environment. So previously, we have a limited amount of information sources. Okay, so you can assume that people all get similar news in the age of mass media, right? However, now as you see in the right figure, we have abundant news channels and people can easily get news from all kinds of sources online, include those alternative media. So now we cannot assume that people still stay on the same page. The audience was split into several groups with different news styles. So that's what we call audience fragmentation. So you may start to ask, okay, why this matter? It really matters. So at least there are lots of implications that we have discussed in communication studies. So let me briefly talk about a few. One is echo chamber. So if echo chamber is true, then people won't be able to hear different voices. They cannot understand each other, given that they don't share the same information base. So you can imagine that makes the conversation between different groups really, really challenging, which will exacerbate some social tensions and cause some social problems like polarizations. Although this relationship is a little bit unclear, but still people speculate about this. Another possibility is about misinformation. So this goes beyond the scope of just about news or politics. For example, even for some scholar doing some health communication, this could be a challenge. I'm not a scholar doing HealthCom, but I have some personal experience. For example, these days it's really challenging for me to talk to some older generations in my family on some health-related issue. So they always share some misinformation from those alternative media sources on social media. For example, they share something like, oh, some kind of lifestyle might cause cancer, or in the couple of years ago, they may share some kind of news about, oh, some combination of food could prevent the diffusion of COVID-19. So I have no idea about the source they use. So you can see, but you can see the prominence of misinformation also has to do with the audience fragmentation dynamic as well. Okay, so you can see this is really, really important. So in the very beginning, this line of research was initiated by some theorists. They worry about the related social problems. So many researchers conduct empirical study on that. So previous research studied this by many different methods, such as experiment and observational studies. However, they find, why we don't find a similar result? So some of them support the prominence of fragmentation, and some of it reject the prominence of fragmentation. But what I want to highlight here, or what I think it is really important, is not to provide an answer on whether there is fragmentation or not, because I believe that the answer is always context dependent. I think that some deeper understanding on why and how different factors account for audience fragmentation and under which condition we can find the fragmentation dynamics could be more important. Again, it's not just about yes or no, but characterizing the effects of different factors that we can know more about the dynamic of this whole pattern, okay? Meanwhile, if we know more about the mechanisms, then we should be better. We should better find some kind of design implications that could help us to think about the intervention to solve these social problems. Okay, so today I will present 3 studies. The first study introduced a network tour of audience fragmentation, and we apply it to analyze the impact of mobile technologies on news audience fragmentation, which highlight how such a technological factor affect audience fragmentation. The second and third studies both are based on the tool that we introduced in the first study here. The second study further examines how various factors explain audience fragmentation. And we also look at various aspects of fragmentation dynamics. The third study, we investigate the interest-driven audience fragmentation. So it's not just about politics, but also about the inequality in society. And that's about another aspect of audience fragmentation. But again, in the whole story, we will build some network tools to help us to examine related issues. Okay, so let me start from the first paper. Again, the goal of the study is to examine how mobile technologies affect audience fragmentation. So the motivation of the study is largely driven by the fact that nowadays mobile news traffic is increasing, but we actually don't know much about it. So why mobile traffic matters? As you can see on the right side of the slides, the survey result drawn from Pew Research Center and the Digital News Report show that mobile news traffic actually becomes increasingly prominent these days. But many prior studies do not look at this part of the traffic at all. So let's say if the mobile traffic is similar to desktop traffic in news consumption, then it is really okay to overlook it, right? Because desktop traffic is representative to the overall traffic. However, the problem is that we have no idea about this representativeness. So we have to have a look at the mobile traffic. But there are several challenges of measuring mobile news consumption. First, you may quickly think, okay, we can use the self-reported data. But self-reported data bring many issues. To give a few examples, the long tail side of the information channels are missing. So survey could only ask a small set of the information channels. Well, those very tiny outlets, we have a lot. So they made up a significant fraction of traffic. They cannot be measured. because we don't have unlimited space in our questionnaire. Meanwhile, self-report is not accurate. In some research, scholars found that people tend to over-report their news exposure. So if we, let's say we don't forget about the survey, many studies start to adopt the observational tracking data, which somewhat improved the measure. But we saw some new problems. The mobile traffic was missing. And finally, previous study mostly look at the snapshot of the news consumption, of the news and news exposure, which overlooked the longitudinal trend at all. So we believe that temporal trend should inform us about the effects of digital technologies, especially these days. We see that the information on digital environments dramatically increase every year. But the previous years, we don't have many studies that seriously deal with the temporal trend. We may miss this important part of the analysis. Okay, so before I start the method, let me briefly talk about the data. So we look at more than 400 news outlets and observe more than 200,000 panelists each month between October 2014 to December 2018. This is a 5-year time window. And each panelist, we put meters on their devices, which include both desktop devices and mobile devices. So this could avoid the issue of self-reported bias for if we use survey. And we also have the mobile traffic there. Okay, so now we have data and we have our goal to measure the audience fragmentation and how it was affected by the mobile technology. Next, how can we get from the data to the audience fragmentation? So we need to build a pipeline to measure audience fragmentation. Here, we start to introduce our network model to do that. So we have mentioned that audience fragmentation theoretically is about, audience split into subgroups reading different news, right? So the intuition of this network method is to look at to what extent audience of different outlets overlapped. Okay, so let's have a quick look at the right side. So each circle is the audience of an outlet. And we try to see whether each pair of the outlets have significant audience overlap or not. So let's see. As we indicated here, CNN has significant overlap with BBC, but these two do not significantly overlap with Fox News. So based on this intuition, we can build a measure of audience fragmentation using the network methods. So specifically, there are 3 steps. First, we build a network with node as outlets and urge as duplicated audience, as shown in the lower part of the figure here. So this could be seen as a projection of a bipartite network between outlets and audience. So this is represented in the upper part of the left figure, okay? So the blue circle here refers to media outlets, and the yellow rectangle refers to news consumers. So you can see this network actually could allow us to capture fragmentation dynamic. Okay, so if, as noted in the figure now, audience are split into 2 groups, which consume distinct sets of outlets. So this is exactly what we mean in fragmentation, right? So which should be reflected in the projected network below. As you can see, the left 3 nodes are disconnected from the right 2 nodes, right? So because the audience of the left 3 nodes have no overlap with the audience of the right 2 nodes. So you can see this kind of network is really helpful for us to understand audience fragmentation, right? So sometimes if you read other studies, they may call it a co-exposure network. Then you may wonder, okay, can we directly look at the network? The simple answer is no. The next step is thresholding. Why we want to use thresholding? Because in the data, we include thousands of panelists. When we try to build the projected one-mode co-exposure network, we may see many overlap, but with different strengths. Okay, so each one people out of the thousands of panelists could contribute to one tie, right? So you can imagine the final product of the co-exposure network will be an almost fully connected network. And now, because most network measures still apply to unweighted networks, so it is very necessary to conduct some filtering before employing those metrics, or we cannot get any meaningful interpretation from this network because they're almost fully connected and those measures are applied to unweighted network. So in short, we have to eliminate those ties that are caused by some random browsing behavior or not significant enough. So we will only focus on those significant audience duplications. So there are three ways of doing this. As you see here above, global thresholding, dyadic thresholding, and egocentric thresholding. So I will skip all the math behind. The theoretical intuition, again, is that we want to preserve those duplication that help us to examine fragmentation. We don't treat two outlets with only one common user as the same as two outlets with thousands of common users, right? We cannot treat them the same. But we cannot just use a simple number to do that, because the threshold between two very large outlets should not be the same as those threshold for the urge between the two small outlets, right? That's not fair. So the logic is to leverage some non-model as the last two technique did. If you have interest, actually, Shuban and I, we have a co-author paper that we discuss the three thresholding strategies and the implication of that. But for this paper, for this project I'm presenting now, the big conclusion is that we just use the last two filtering techniques to strengthen the robustness of our conclusion and also get rid of those insignificant duplications. Okay, we have finished the first two steps. Now we can borrow some network metrics to measure fragmentation. So in employing network density, defined as the ratio of the number of observed urges and the number of possible urges given the size of the network. So these metrics range from 0 to 1, so it's a standardized matrix. So if all outlets have no significant audience overlap between them, as indicated in the left upper plot, the density value is 0 because there's no audience overlap between any outlets. So in other words, you can think in this way, audiences are super loyal to their own outlets. And the audience is split into many subgroups with different news styles. So that's exactly what we mean fragmentation, right? However, on the other hand, if all outlets have significant overlaps between each other, then the density is 1, because for all pairs of outlets, significant audience overlap were identified. So that also means that there's no evidence of audience fragmentation, at least observed from the plot. So we cannot see that they were split into groups. Okay, so you can imagine in the real world, we want C0, want C1. Those real world situation always stand in between these two extremes, right? But you can imagine a higher value of density means that it is more like the situation on the right lower plot. So it is a low level of fragmentation. In contrast, a low level of density means that it's more like the situation on the left upper plot. That indicates a higher level of fragmentation. Okay, so here's the result. So we can use the digital data to get the audience fragmentation level for different technologies. So here, the plot x-axis refer to the 5-year time window from 2014 to 2018. Y-axis is the audience fragmentation level. So there are two plots because, as I mentioned, we use two techniques to filter the ties in the networks. So we include both for robustness, but actually they show very similar results. The yellow lines here refer to the result based on the desktop traffic, and the green line refer to the result based on multi-platform traffic. So multi-platform here comprise both mobile traffic and desktop traffic. Okay, so from this figure, I want to highlight 3 findings. First, the desktop data overestimates the extent of fragmentation, especially if you see in the later period. If we look at the PMI network in the later months, so desktop has a value of below 0.5, but multi-platform is about 0.8. Second, the trend of multi-platform is rising, which means that relying on digital technologies, people increasingly use a more diverse pool of information sources. So in other words, fragmentation is decreasing over time. But if you look at desktop data, we see an opposite conclusion. So the density level actually is decreasing. Therefore, using a desktop owning data could give us a distorted picture. Okay, so to sum up, this study suggests that mobile technology could not be overlooked. So audience fragmentation is decreasing over time, and this trend could only be captured by looking at multi-platform data, as desktop data alone give us an opposite conclusion. So which also suggests that mobile technologies predict a lower level of fragmentation. Okay, so previous study built a pipeline to measure audience fragmentation. And by applying that to both desktop and mobile news traffic data, we can measure how such a technological factor affect audience fragmentation. But there are still many things we don't know, right? For example, we indeed feel that we're living in a society with a high level of polarization today. But why does not reflect on the audience duplication network we just see? Meanwhile, we usually assume that news audience fragmentation should be mostly explained by political ideology and ideological selective exposure. But is that true? We need to further think about how we can advance the tool we just talk about to answer these questions. That's what we're doing in the second paper. Okay, so again, give you some theoretical background on this. It is still about the fragmentation. So people believe that fragmentation is about people split into groups, and each group contains only like-minded people having the same news styles. But when we think about the general idea about audience fragmentation, actually, the broader definition think of fragmentation It is about dissolution of audience into smaller units into a society regarding news styles or information consumed, as well as the engagement with the information and the cognition they brought from such an engagement. So this generalized serialization highlights actually two things. One is that the framework of fragmentation could be applied to study other aspects of the information behavior. It is not just about exposure, but also about engagement and cognition. Because we all know that, okay, reading news itself is not something that exerts most impact, right? News exposure is just a means, it's not an end itself. And effective engagement is one important pathway to further political outcomes, such as polarization or other outcomes. So that is something we care more in the society. So again, information behavior are often treated as a pathway to some further goals, like civic engagement. So that's why we all, besides exposure, we need to also look at other aspects in this kind of pipeline: exposure, engagement, or even further outcomes. But it's this audience fragmentation could not just about exposure. It could also be about engagement. That's the one thing I want to highlight here. The second is that the general framework does not really highlight a simple dynamic of ideological selectivity. So it could be accounted by lots of factors, not about just ideologies. For example, some outlets are elite-oriented, so they are catering to people with more education or high SES, so socioeconomic status. So should account, this kind of dynamic should also account for audience fragmentation dynamics. So in this study, there are two goals here: to advance the tools to allow us measure engagement-based audience fragmentation and to characterize how different factors account for audience fragmentation dynamics. Okay. So regarding the first thing, we go back to our original bipartite network presented here. So again, in the original network, the node is the media and the urge is the exposure behavior. So by projecting it to one mode network, we get co-exposure network, right? And this is how we can analyze audience fragmentation. Here, we expand the network model to investigate engagement-based fragmentation. So we look at one specific engagement aspect, the trust to media outlets. So to measure fragmentation of trust towards media, you can imagine we change this network. So node is still media, but urge is whether an audience trusts in certain news outlets or not. So you can imagine by applying this adjusted version of network, we can get a co-trust network, which allow us to measure fragmentation in news trust. Okay, so here are the results. One quick sentence about the data, because we need to deal with the engagement and the cognitive level. So we use the survey results from Pew, ATP survey results, which have both trust and exposure. It is self-report to 30 media outlets in the US. So in this figure, the upper part is co-exposure network, and below is the co-trust network. So I use the gray color to mark those urges that apply in both networks. Okay, we see many, many gray urges. I use the blue color to mark the urges appearing in co-exposure network only, and the red color to show those urges that appear only in co-trust networks. Okay, so if you have a look, you can see that in the upper parts, it is somewhat well-connected network with some pattern of two clusters, but not that prominent. not salient. However, many edges between the left and the right disappear in the below part of the co-trust network. This means that while from the exposure, we don't observe a clear pattern of fragmentation. From the co-trust network, we can clearly observe the two clusters. So you can see people may use a variety of sources to read news, but they do not necessarily trust a similar set of news outlets. Now, as I mentioned, we have two goals. So expand from the exposure to engagement and the cognitive level, and to explain the dynamics that account for fragmentation. Now let's move to the second part. So to identify the contribution of various factors in audience fragmentation, we build a series of audience similarity network based on different characteristics. For example, here demonstrate how we can build a partisan audience similarity network based on partisanship. So first, we get the audience composition of partisanship of different outlets. And step two, we conduct a series of chi-square tests to examine whether they're similar or dissimilar in the composition of audience partisanship. For those that are similar, then we draw a tie between them. So that's what we get and after the step 3. So we draw the ties based on the results. So you can imagine we do not, we can apply these techniques to a variety of factors, including gender, age, income, education, etc. So here I show 3 examples. So partisan-based exposure similarity network, gender-based exposure similarity network, and religiosity-based exposure similarity network. So you can see in the left upper partisan-based exposure similarity network, we see several disconnected components, right? So that's more like what we usually expect to find in audience fragmentation network. So now we have those networks. And how can we get the contribution of different factors? So if a factor indeed account for the audience fragmentation dynamics, then audience will be different regarding this factor. So this is a missing link in the similarity network. And audience will not be significantly duplicated. So that's another missing link, but that's in audience co-exposure network, right? So you can imagine the logic is that the more a similarity network could predict the audience duplication network, the more a factor could explain audience fragmentation dynamics. So here comes the result. So as we mentioned, we construct a series of exposure similarity networks and trust similarity networks with factor of serious demographic and political factors. And we regress these networks to predict co-exposure and co-trust network respectively. So in this table, I want to highlight 3 findings. First, you can see in both networks, yes, partisanship play a big role. But second, besides partisanship, we see many understudied factors playing a significant role as well. So for example, age, gender, race, religiosity, especially pay special attention to religiosity because it's significant in both specifications, but it looks like we don't pay much attention previously. Finally, co-exposure and co-trust are explained by somewhat different set of factors. For example, co-trust is predicted by age similarity, but that's not the fact for co-exposure. And in contrast, for co-exposure, it's significantly predicted by gender and race similarity, but this is not the case for co-trust. So To wrap up this study, we advanced some network tools to expand the fragmentation research. We show that audience fragmentation is driven by an expanded set of factors, and some understudied factors actually could still also explain audience fragmentation dynamic. It's not just about partisanship. Meanwhile, there are differences between co-exposure and co-trust network. We can see it's not just in the network structure. Remember, co-trust network has a clear two-cluster structure, but also the factors that explain these two networks are different. So this means that although people may use different or they use a variety of news sources, but this does not mean that they all trust them equally. The fragmented news trust may relate to some serious issue. Maybe fragmentation, polarization could be one potential outcomes. Okay. Okay, so finally, let me talk about the third study. So in the third study, we further adjusted the network model to study another fragmentation issue, the fragmentation based on content category. So fragmentation is not just about political issues, but it also has some implications of social inequality. So that's about this aspect of fragmentation. So in previous two studies, we look at news audience, right? And how the news audience was split into groups. But the very first step to become a news audience actually is overlooked. So some prior scholar like Marcus Pryor actually argued that in high trace media environments, we have lots of media options. It's not just about news, but also have entertainment and other stuff. And people have different interests. So those who don't like news, actually they can effectively avoid news, and those like it can read as much as possible. So you can think this could also lead to audience fragmentation, but that's based on interest. Again, so those who like news, read news. Those who like entertainment, consume entertainment content. So because if you in political communication, we largely believe that if you read news, that will predict further participation in politics, as well as being represented in political system. So you can think this kind of fragmentation could suggest an inequality between lots of different groups, right? Especially those groups that could be represented in politics, and those who may not be able to be represented. So in other words, it causes inequality in politics between groups along the line of political interests. But is this true? So that's the focus of this study, whether we can see the interest-based audience fragmentation. Okay, so let's change our network model again. So look at the original bipartite network. Again, node is media outlets and urge is exposure, right? Here, each outlet contain a variety of content. So including very serious news content like election, politics, and those light issues like sports and entertainment. So the previous network cannot help us answer the question we care about at all, right? Because even let's say CNN and Fox News have a tie, but we don't know this audience is just about one topic or they actually consume a variety of topics. So here we need to change the network's model. We changed the node. Last time the second study, we changed the urge. Here we changed the node. So node is no longer media outlets, but media categories. So in the projected co-exposure network, node is content of one category, and urge refer to the duplicated audience of two content categories. Okay, so to test this, I use the commenting data from Toutiao. So this is a Chinese information aggregator, which presents both news and entertainment content to the user. So you can see this is an example. The feed page presents many content, including news, like here. It's about one legal issue that will be passed. And it also includes some non-news content, like here, how an actress could become popular and successful. Yeah. So once you clicked each article, you will enter an article page. And at the end of the article page, you will see the comment page, which displayed user interacting with the article. So we know that those users must have been consuming the articles. Therefore, the commenting behavior at least show that they have consumed the news content. But again, I want to make a quick note here. In this study, we look at the commenting behavior. Although the starting point is about engagement, but we use the commenting data as the first step to examine the relationship we care about. In the future, if we have better data, then definitely we can try to replicate this in the engagement or the exposure data to further test this relationship. But again, here, we use the commenting data to function as the first step to test this relationship, whether people are fragmented based on different content categories. Okay, so Toutiao, this platform provides both news and non-news, especially entertainment content. This gives a chance to test this dynamics. So for many of you who have no idea about this platform is developed by ByteDance. So it has a very popular product called TikTok. Everybody knows it, right? So when I mention this, what will you think of? TikTok. Yes, the super powerful recommendation algorithm, which provides content that align with one's interests. So Toutiao, the platform we look at, also have a very, very powerful recommendation algorithm. It can curate one's feed page. So you can imagine if someone has a tendency to isolate him or herself in a topical filter bubble, then the data from Toutiao definitely will allow us to find a more prominent pattern of it, right? However, that's not the case. So let me start to talk about the result. First, let's look at the audience fragmentation. So out of our expectation, the network here tell us that there's no fragmentation between various content categories. Here, the density value is almost 1, which means that basically any two content categories have significant amount of audience overlap. So the worrisome inequality based on interest-based fragmentation may not be true. And you can see I highlight 4 categories that are more likely to be classified as news. So they are not clustered together in this network. Besides this, let me talk about another finding. So to understand the relationship between news and entertainment, we collapse all the categories into 2 groups, so news and entertainment, and we look at their relationship. Again, so if the interest-based fragmentation hypothesis is true, then we should see some kind of negative association here. But the result in this figure shows that that's not the case. The x-axis plots the 10 deciles of entertainment contents. Y-axis demonstrates the corresponding news comments of the group. So you can see the figure actually clearly show a positive relationship between news and entertainment. So that's different from what the interest-based fragmentation hypothesis suggested. Okay, so let me sum up what we have today. So I leverage network tools to investigate under what condition we can observe audience fragmentation, and then try to investigate the factors that explain this dynamics. So there are low levels of audience fragmentation observed from co-exposure network between both outlets and content categories. Meanwhile, we found that mobile technology play a very important role in lowering the fragmentation level. Meanwhile, we also find that a variety of factors contribute to audience fragmentation. However, we see some worrisome pattern from the co-trust network. It is more prominent from there, and we may interpret that as a very dangerous signal. Okay. But from the methods, from the methodological perspective, I want to use these three cases to show that by advancing the network tools, we can expand our original research framework of audience fragmentation, which help us to identify various levels of fragmentation and dynamics that account for the pattern that we observed. So I would say that this reflects on general idea in computational social science. We have lots of data and increasingly powerful computational capacities. So this means that we have a lot of flexibility to advance and sharpen the instruments and the methods. And sometimes we cannot make some argument just because we lack the relevant tools to help us to substantiate certain claims. So we may consider advancing the tools or identify the problems in the methodologies. In this way, we may pave the way to make theoretical contribution to social science research in general. I think I've done. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yang, for giving this wonderful talk. Do we have any questions from participants?
Hey, yeah, I'm Shubhayan here. Can you see me?
Yay, I can see you.
So I think on the first day of the first day, right, we had a session on network analysis 6, right? And there was a lot of questions from participants about it's great that these tools exist, but what do we do with these tools? What sort of network analysis can we do? And in the social sciences. And I think your talk really helps. I mean, I know that some of that work is with me myself. So we have done some work where see like a real area of application of social science, where it's of network science, where it's not, the networks are not what you think of when you normally think of networks. Normally, when you think of networks, it's people. Nodes are people, and the edges between them kind of show some kind of relationship between people, groups, organizations, right? But in this case, I think it's really interesting. I think it's not the most obvious kind of social network to think of when you think of social network, right? Where the nodes are media outlets and you're actually capturing relationships between media outlets, right? So I was wondering if you could maybe, I mean, I'm not asking for myself because I'm aware of this literature because you have worked on this for a while. Maybe you could talk more generally about where you think network science maybe could be in communication, could be outside communication, where it can kind of, provide interesting insights that can actually enrich social science theory. I mean, your example was obviously about news consumption in the US and in China, but network science we all know has lots of other applications, right? So from a very high level perspective of someone who may not be aware of the various ways in which network science can be used, you talk more generally a bit about how you see this field being useful to people not necessarily in communication.
Thanks, Ruban. I like this question. I actually appreciate that. My sense is that I think so. I remember 7 years ago when I was still a student and I attend ICA at that time, I noticed an interesting pattern that is computational methods division of communication research. We notice that most research are actually just showing fancy plots, showing interesting figures, but actually they provide very limited insights to that. And these days we see some interesting trends that for some research, for some line of research, for example, audience fragmentation, social movements, actually it's using network model become a legitimate choice to do that. So I feel that it for many different fields, once we can establish some legitimate model to use network to capture certain social dynamics, and we can make some kind of theoretical contribution to the field, then this way of using network science to solve the problem will become legitimate in the field as well. So it means that in the future, different. I mean, obviously you can see from my presentation, I was staying with the audience fragmentation research and the co-exposure network, right? So this relationship between these two, co-exposure network and audience duplication scholarship, now is legitimate. At least I would say it's legitimate in communication research. And based on these kind of relationship, we can further expand the network model to further provide theoretical insights. But in the future, I think network scientists, especially those researchers who want to use network science to make theoretical contribution, we need to think about how we can build some legitimate model, network model, and associate it with some legitimate, with the corresponding research questions. And by making this conceptualization and operationalization, we can further use the network model to study more different research questions. But unfortunately, I would say that these days, the legitimate, so-called the legitimate application are not a lot, or I would say that we have abundant rules or lots of questions we can try to explore. But I think the first step, we need to build this successful link between the network model we build for the question and the question we have. We need to build this linkage first. After that, we can try to use the model to solve the question and make the theoretical contribution. Yeah.
Is there any more questions? Good to see you again. So I do have a question about because I really appreciate that your study is in a sequence and all of the concepts are internally connected. But I'm wondering because one of your study is in the more Western context and another is in a more Chinese Asian context. So did you find that fragmentation is a context dependent thing? And the second question is, since like there's a theory kind of effect. So in your studies, do you have a next step? Like after news consumption and news trust, do you have another variables that you're interested in?
Thanks for your question. Thank you, Ian. Long time no see. So the first question you're asking about the context dependent thing, I would say that I don't think that it is context dependent because it relates to the media technology and information environment in general. So First, we have the digital technology that could allow different information sources to produce their content and disseminate the content on the platform, right? So basically, it is not an issue of specific context or country. It is about the digital technology and the information environment we have in general. But of course, it could have some different characteristics. For example, in the Western context or in the US context, we see a high level of polarization, and so that all this issue could be easily politicized. So that could somewhat make a small difference. So again, that's why we need to apply or use or study this dynamic in different contexts, because studying this dynamic in different contexts could allow us to see the commonality and the difference. And sometimes the commonality could help us to understand the underlying factors, for example, technology and its role in facilitating the pattern we could see now. The second question is about next step, right? Yeah, I think the next step, at least, actually, I have discussed this with Shubai this actually last month, about a couple of months before, I think. So we think that the current audience fragmentation scholarship, we have more data and more and we don't see we basically using this network model. As I would say that we have done a lot of we have seen a lot of studies, but but you can see even by using this network model, a fully connected network does not really necessarily mean that there is no fragmentation, right? When I make the presentation, I'm very I made a very cautious statement about this, because it is just using this network model. Maybe let's say we can capture the difference between different technologies and different scenarios, but this does not mean that there's no fragmentation at all. We may need to further. Now we have. We may try to advance this model to see whether in the future whether there's a better model that could better capture audience fragmentation. Because here, even let's say 3 nodes fully connected, it could be that one group that consume all 3 outlets, but it could also mean that there are 3 groups that each group consume 2 sets of 2 outlets, right? So network model in this study cannot distinguish these 2 scenarios. So maybe in the future, let's see whether we can develop a better model to further capture such a dynamic. But yeah, let's see how it goes. Yeah, thanks for your question.
Any more questions?
Oh, you go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Yang. I have a question about because I wanted to know, because you are looking at the audience fragmentation, right? And I'm wondering to know if it is possible to use the network to predict what kind of the audience fragmentation they will be consume other kind of news. How can I organize my question? I want to just, because I think I saw the network analysis you use right now is kind of a discrimination on the how audience fragmentation to influence their news consumption, right? So I'm wondering to know, is that possible based on the different kinds of or different attributes of the audience attribution to predict which kind of the news they will consume in the future?
Okay, thanks for your question. You are talking about, so in this study, we have one group of audience, right? So it's a huge group, and we'll try to capture the dynamics of fragmentation. Actually, there's a paper published in 2019 by by our advisor, Sandra Gonzalez-Balin, in political communication. In that paper, actually, they look at different subgroups and how subgroups show various fragmentation dynamics. So if you split groups, split audience into different groups and try to apply the model to subgroups, that could tell you something about, okay, whether it is some groups that show more fragmentation pattern or not. Yeah, that could be one way of doing it. Have I answered your question? Is this what you are asking?
Yes. Yeah. The question I want to ask you about this because I saw maybe in the second articles you're sharing with us is to predicting a co-exposure, co-trust network. Yeah, I see a lot of variables you consider in it. So I just want to know that because in Chinese context, we will to divide the people into different kinds of their how to say that they can be divided into different groups, different hobby groups, and they will have a different types news communication. But sometimes we know a lot of people's recommendation will be push these audience to acquire or expose to other kind of news. Yeah. So yeah, I was wondering maybe it would be another path to predict something like that. Yeah.
This is a very good point. I would say that for the second study, we're exploring different factors. But if you notice, it's all more about individual characteristics or about the group or about characteristic related dynamic. What you are saying is about whether the structure factors like what do you say, the recommendation algorithm or the network or peer influence, right? Yeah, or whether those will shape the dynamic. So that's indeed a very valuable questions. But maybe that's needs us to revise the model again and try to see whether we can try to incorporate these ideas into the network model and to run this again. Let's see how it goes. But this is a very interesting point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Which I also found very interesting and it's giving me a lot of ideas. I was just wondering, so my question is not about audience fragmentation, but I was just wondering if you are aware of or other possibilities of maybe having networks where instead of media and audience, you can have like media and let's say certain issues or topics to see if there's like fragmentation in terms of coverage. Yeah, I don't know. We just want to hear what your thoughts are.
Okay, you're asking a very, very good question. Thank you. You're asking that whether we can further revise the model to use the topic or issue as the node instead of the content category, right? So that maybe it could help us to capture, for example, issue publics, right? So those who are more interested in certain issue. Yeah, definitely that could be an idea. But again, this is about whether, again, all this network modeling process actually is a process of building theory. Again, all this all this network model here I show is based on the research question I want to ask. I would say that of course, but again, this is I would say iterative process. I don't think it is necessary to just go from research question to model. Sometimes if you see, okay, the problem in the current modeling process, then you revise the model, you can also help you answer some research question, as you just mentioned. But I think one issue that's why as far as I know, I don't see many research leveraging leveraging the network model as what you said. I think the issue is because the issue-based network or topic-based network, the boundary of setting the issue or topic is a little bit hard, right? Think about it. How can you measure whether one has consumed, let's say, still about news, consumed news article about, let's say, abortion, right? How can you, I mean, of course, you can do that if you have a second by second URL visits and you get the articles and you get the title and the, all this content of the article. But you can imagine the workload of doing that. Maybe in the future, once we have a better categorization algorithm or modeling stuff, then that could help us automatically generate abundant topics or issues. But if you cannot do that step, then I can see why people have not moved to that direction. But again, if let's say if we can have some data and we can get rid of this issue, then definitely this could be a very interesting potential direction. Yeah, thanks for sharing your idea.
Any more questions? I think then that's all from our audience. And before we end the session, let's give a round of applause to Dr. Yang.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you so much for sharing your research. We're looking forward to seeing you again.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.